No,
Okay.
I just didn't plan enough on my end, and so we are going to do the fetal pig dissection this week. You know, hopefully you guys can get that done sometime this week.
I'm actually doing that tonight.
Okay.
So I'm gonna do that tonight. Tonight's my only night off of work, so
Okay.
I'm
Cool.
gonna get it done tonight.
Cool.
All right. If we want to just play around with the urinary lab in there, is there a pamphlet that you could email me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just
There's
because
not one in
it's
there?
in there. It's in there, and I just want to play around with it, see,
Yeah.
and do like the lab bit, but of course not submit it, but do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. No problem.
Alrighty.
All right. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen, and we will go over the urinary system. And I think all of your grades are up to date right now. I know there's still a few more assignments to get in, but I think as of now, I tried to make sure everybody's grades are up to date. So start looking at those on Moodle and let me know if you see something that seems really off. I teach another class at GCC on Moodle, and for some reason, one of their exams, it graded like 2/3 of the students. There's like 1/3 of the students that don't have a grade for their exam. When I go in, I can see that they did it and I can see the answers and I can manually grade it. So weird things happen sometimes, you know? So I had a bunch of panicked emails yesterday, and I don't blame anybody, you know, that they didn't have a grade in. So I'm just a little skeptical sometimes of all of these things, you know, all the Moodle doing everything that it should do, or Blackboard or whatever system you're using. Okay. So the urinary system. The urinary system is pretty basic, right? The major functions are to excrete and eliminate waste products from your blood. Okay. Your kidneys, your ureters, your bladder, and your urethra are the only organs of your urinary system. So you have your kidneys, you have a tube going from each kidney to the bladder, that's called a ureter. You have the bladder, and then you have the urethra, which is a tube going from the bladder to the outside of the body. Every time your heart beats, a portion of that blood goes to your kidneys. So something around 20 or 25% goes to your kidneys, and your kidneys are filtering the blood. And so your kidneys are responsible for filtering all sorts of salts out of your blood. They're responsible for filtering just volume, right? So filtering water out, making sure that, you know, if you're dehydrated, you're holding on to more water. If you're very well hydrated, you're passing more water into your urine, all that sort of thing. So your kidneys are really important in maintaining homeostasis, because they're maintaining the amounts of like sodium and potassium and chloride and all these different ions and water in your bloodstream. Okay, so the organs of the urinary system, like I said, it's pretty basic. There's your kidneys. There's a tube going from each kidney to the bladder. That tube is called the ureter. There's your bladder, and then there's a tube from the bladder to the outside of the body called the urethra. And so what's happening is your kidneys are filtering the blood. Whatever gets filtered out passes down these ureters to your bladder. And when your bladder gets full, you eliminate it from your body, you excrete it. Right. Kidney location, they are low down in your abdominal cavity, between your last thoracic and third lumbar vertebrae, so kind of your lower back. Your right kidney does sit slightly lower than the left, because your liver is there on your right side of your abdomen, so kind of pushes the kidney down. They are behind the peritoneum, so behind all of your digestive organs that we learned about. So behind, you know, the small intestines, the large intestines, all that sort of thing. So because of that, they're called retroperitoneal, right? Retro is a term we hear a lot. Retro means behind, and retroperitoneal is behind the peritoneum. On top of each kidney is your adrenal gland, right? Anytime you see the word renal, that has something to do with your kidneys. And so adrenal is on top of the kidney, right above the kidney. And here's a closer picture from the back of where the kidneys sit. So you can see that they start just about where your last couple of thoracic vertebrae are. So kind of where your last couple of ribs are, right? And they're sitting there in your lower back. And here is a section through somebody's abdomen. You can see the stomach and the spleen and the pancreas. Here's the kidney sitting behind them. So it's retroperitoneal. It's behind the peritoneum. They are bean-shaped, right? They have an indentation on one side. And that indentation happens to be where the renal artery enters the kidney, the renal vein leaves the kidney, the ureter leaves the kidney. So it's right at that curve. And that curve is called a hilum, H-I-L-U-M, which is a common term for that part of an organ where veins either go into or come out of the organ. It is covered by a fibrous capsule. So here is a cross section through the kidney. Now, there are many structures within the kidney, okay? Within the kidney itself, we divide the kidney into a cortex and a medulla. Cortex is the outer thickness, medulla is the inner part. So the cortex is this light, kind of light purple or light gray, everything above these triangles. From the tops of these triangles, from where that red and blue dotted line is, down towards the center, that's all medulla. The actual triangles, these purple triangles themselves, are called renal pyramids. This one's labeled here. So this actual purple triangle is a renal pyramid. And in between the renal pyramids, you have these areas of kind of lighter colored tissue. Those are called renal columns. Oops. Okay, so we've got the renal pyramids in purple, the columns in white. At the bottom of each renal pyramid is a renal papilla. They have this one labeled here. That little rounded part at the bottom of the pyramid, that's the papilla. What the papilla goes into is called the minor calyx. And then where you have two or more of these calyces merging together, that's a major calyx. So this is a major calyx. Each one of these is a minor calyx. And then all of the major calyces merge together to form the pelvis. Right? And the renal pelvis empties into the ureter. Now, what we will see is the filtration actually happens as fluid travels down this renal pyramid. So we'll see that fluid comes into the kidney, into the cortex. It travels down the renal pyramid. And as it's traveling down through the renal pyramid, it gets filtered. What gets filtered out, the waste product that gets filtered out, travels through a renal papilla. Where's my cursor? Travels through a renal papilla, a minor calyx, a major calyx, the renal pelvis, the ureter. Okay, it's important to know that pathway. The actual structures that do the filtering are called nephrons. And here on the right, they're showing one nephron in purple. So you can see it here. They're showing it here. They're showing it enlarged over here on the right. The nephrons are actually in the renal pyramids. So as fluid's moving through this nephron, it's being filtered. Whatever gets filtered out is in this part of the nephron, travels through the collecting duct, travels through the renal papilla, right, into the minor calyx, into the major calyx, into the renal pelvis, into the ureter. Now we have, this enlargement is actually exaggerated. We have about 1 million or a little over 1 million nephrons per kidney. We have enough nephrons in one kidney to filter all of your blood, which is why you can be a living donor. You only need one kidney. And the nephron itself has names for the parts of the nephron. Okay. So at the beginning of the nephron, there's this rounded area, this bulb. That's called the renal corpuscle. There's a tube leaving the renal corpuscle. That's called the proximal convoluted tubule, right? It's proximal because it's close to that corpuscle. It's convoluted, it's all twisted up. That leads to a nephron loop, right? So renal corpuscle, proximal convoluted tubule, nephron loop. We have a descending limb and an ascending limb. Then you have a distal convoluted tubule. Distal because it's further away from the renal corpuscle. And that distal convoluted tubule meets up with a collecting duct. Okay. And you can see that there are other nephrons that would meet up with the same collecting duct. So think of this as, being in 360 degrees coming out of the computer towards you. There would be more than just one nephron leading to one collecting duct. A collecting duct would have several nephrons emptying into it. And what each nephron is doing is they are filtering your blood. Whatever ends up in this collecting duct travels through the renal papilla, minor calyx, the major calyx, the renal pelvis, the ureter. That becomes your urine, right? Whatever's filtered out, whatever's here at this point, at the collecting duct, becomes your urine. Now, we have to overlay the blood flow on top of this, right? Because we're talking about filtering your blood. So we have a really large artery coming into the kidney, bringing blood directly from your aorta into your kidney. Because what's coming in is one fluid. Your kidney is dividing it into two different fluids, right? A waste product and a clean blood. So what's coming in is coming in through this large red artery called your renal artery. The renal artery then branches into segmental arteries. Segmental arteries branch into interlobar arteries. They go in between the pyramids, the interlobar artery. Interlobar arteries branch into arcuate arteries. Arcuate arteries are the ones that separate the cortex from the medulla, right? They're the ones that are right at the top of these pyramids. Branching off of the arcuate arteries going up into the cortex, those are called cortical radiate arteries. And so what they're showing over here on the right is a bit of an enlargement. You can see the renal pyramid. You can see the interlobar artery, which brings blood in between each pyramid, which branches into the arcuate artery, right? This one that separates the medulla and the cortex, which branches into cortical radiate arteries that go up into the cortex. Off of each cortical radiate artery, there are these afferent arterioles, right? Little tiny blood vessels, little tiny arteries. Those lead into the nephrons. So this, you can see where they've drawn a couple of nephrons here in purple, right? So the blood coming into the kidney goes renal artery, segmental artery, interlobar artery, arcuate artery, cortical radiate artery, afferent arterioles, and it leads that afferent arteriole, each one of those leads into its own nephron. Because the nephrons are filtering the blood. You have to get blood to the nephrons, that's what they're filtering. That's what they're going to filter. We'll see that the nephrons filter the blood, and I'll show you how in a minute. And then the clean blood, so the nephrons filter the blood. You can see where the nephrons are, right? We already discussed where the nephrons are. What they filter out of the blood travels down through this renal papilla, minor calyx, major calyx, renal pelvis, ureter. The clean blood right? The other part, not the part that's filtered out, not the waste part. The clean blood is going to travel back through veins, which all have the same names as the arteries, right? So it's going to travel back through cortical radiate veins and through arcuate veins, interlobar veins, until it gets all the way back to a renal vein, which goes back, that's this big vein here, which goes back to your inferior vena cava, back up to your heart. Right, so the renal artery is carrying blood into the kidneys filtering that blood. The clean blood is leaving through the renal vein. What gets filtered out travels down through this ureter, this tan structure here. It goes down to the bladder so you can get rid of it. Okay. So this shows the blood supply to the kidney. This is the order that they go in, right? The blood comes into the kidney through the renal artery, segmental arteries, interlobar arteries, arcuate arteries, cortical radiate arteries. Afferent arteriole. What we haven't talked about in the middle here, we'll talk about in a minute, is afferent arteriole to glomerular to efferent arteriole. That's what we're going to talk about in a minute. But then once the blood is filtered, it travels back through cortical radiate veins, arcuate veins, interlobar veins, renal veins, right? So these are all the same names as the arteries, just going in the opposite direction. Now, this is a picture showing a nephron with the actual blood supply. So this is the same picture. Figure B here is the same picture that we saw a few moments ago, right? Where you had the blood supply coming in, the interlobar artery, arcuate artery, cortical radiate artery, and then you have the afferent arterioles. So enlarge that once again. And you can see this afferent arteriole is bringing blood into the nephron. The nephron's purple, right? The arteriole is red. It's bringing it into that renal corpuscle. Inside that renal corpuscle, inside that rounded part, are capillaries, right? These red things are capillaries. And that is called the glomerulus. It is spelled over here on the right. Glomerulus, glomerulus. So the glomerulus is the actual blood supply, the actual capillaries that are in here. What happens is your blood pressure is solely responsible for filtration here. We know that capillaries are really thin, right? We know that that's where oxygen and carbon dioxide can get in and out of the bloodstream. They have really thin walls. Well, these capillaries, the glomerulus, are the same. They're really thin walls. So when the afferent arteriole brings blood into the glomerulus, your blood pressure is high enough that some of that plasma gets squeezed out. Pretty much all of it gets squeezed out. Everything except for proteins. Proteins are too big to fit out of the capillaries. But all of the glucose, the water, the sodium, the potassium, the chloride, all of that stuff gets squeezed out. And when it gets squeezed out, it ends up in this purple tubule. It ends up in the nephron, right? And it's going to travel through the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, the distal convoluted tubule, the collecting duct. Now remember, whatever's in your collecting duct goes eventually to the ureter and becomes urine. Well, in this first step, in the renal corpuscle, you are squeezing out too much. You're squeezing out everything because your blood pressure is high enough that you're squeezing out all of the salts, all of the sugar, you're squeezing out all of the water. It's too much, right? Your body needs to hold on to some of that. You need calcium, you need sodium, you need potassium. So what you have is this unique situation where you have capillaries wrapped all around this nephron. Now we know that capillaries have a really thin wall. The nephron has just as thin a wall as the capillary. So what's happening now? The afferent arteriole brings blood into the nephron. In those capillaries that are called the glomerulus, everything gets squeezed out of the blood. And all of that stuff is in this purple tubule. But your body says, well, wait, you squeezed out too much. I need to hold on to some of that. So as that fluid is moving through this purple tubule, the capillaries are reabsorbing some of those nutrients. So the reason that these capillaries are surrounding the tubule is that they're reabsorbing some of the water. They're reabsorbing some of the sodium and the potassium and the chloride and the calcium, right? They're saying, hold on, don't get rid of all of that. We need some of it. So don't pass all of it to the urine. Don't get rid of all of it. We need some of it, right? So step one is kind of what happens in this corpuscle where too much gets filtered out. Step two is that as the fluid's moving through this nephron, your capillaries are reabsorbing it, okay? Whatever does not get reabsorbed by the time the fluid reaches the collecting duct, notice there's no capillaries around the collecting duct. So whatever's still in this tubule, by the time it gets to the collecting duct, that becomes your urine. So in other words, you filter everything out. You only reabsorb some of it. You only reabsorb a percentage of it. Whatever doesn't get reabsorbed gets passed on to your urine, okay? So the afferent arteriole brings blood into the nephron. Those capillaries inside that corpuscle are called the glomerulus. Leaving that is an efferent arteriole, which then wraps around the nephron. These capillaries that are wrapped around the nephron are called peritubular capillaries. Peri just means surrounding. Peritubular, surrounding the tubule. If you look, these peritubular capillaries all kind of lead to this blue venule here, which ends up being your cortical radiate vein, which flows back to your arcuate vein, your interlobar vein, etc. So the blood coming into the nephron is unfiltered. Everything gets squeezed out of the blood at the beginning of the nephron. Your body says, oh, wait, I need to hold on to that. It starts to reabsorb a lot of those nutrients into the capillaries. Whatever gets reabsorbed ends up in your quote unquote clean blood, right? And that flows back to your veins to get back to your heart. Whatever does not get reabsorbed stays in this collecting duct and travels through the renal papilla, the minor calyx, the major calyx, the renal pelvis, into the ureters and into your bladder and becomes your urine. And that is really how this whole system works. Now, step one of, usually they say there's 3 steps to urine formation. Step one is called glomerular filtration. Step one is what happens here in this rounded part, right? Too much gets filtered out. Glomerular filtration, too much gets squeezed out. Step two is called reabsorption, right? Tubular reabsorption. What you're doing is you are reabsorbing the nutrients from the tubule into the bloodstream. That's step two. Step three happens just before the collecting duct. So in the distal convoluted tubule, step three is called tubular secretion. In step one, you filter out too much. Step two, you reabsorb what you need, but a lot of times you reabsorb a little too much. So step three is kind of that fine tuning. You can push stuff back to the tubule. That's where a lot of medications and things like that get pushed back into your urine so that they can get removed from your body. That's happening at this end of the nephron, right? So step three is called tubular secretion. Glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, tubular secretion. Now, what this picture is really showing is two different nephrons. Most of your nephrons look like this, right? They look like figure C, right? And the loop itself, the entire nephron, including the loop, is mostly in the cortex. Those are called cortical nephrons because they reside in the cortex. About 85% of the nephrons in your kidney are cortical. However, the other 15% have a really long nephron loop, which dips down into the medulla, right? See how this one's dipped down into the renal pyramid, which is in the medulla. Those are called juxtamedullary nephrons, right? And that's the only difference, is that the juxtamedullary nephrons have a really long loop of Henle. It has to do with more water reabsorption. We're not going to get into that. But most of your nephrons are cortical, but make sure you know the difference between cortical and juxtamedullary. In juxtamedullary, you'll notice you have something that's pointing to the vasa recta. Those are the same exact thing as peritubular capillaries. They're just given a different name when they surround the loop of a juxtamedullary nephron. They're called a vasa recta. The same thing though, they're just peritubular capillaries. They're surrounding the tubule, reabsorbing nutrients. Okay. So here's the nephron again. We went through this already, right? There's your renal corpuscle, proximal convoluted tubule, your loop of Henle, or your nephron loop, right? Some books call it a loop of Henle. Your distal convoluted tubule, the collecting duct. The renal corpuscle itself is a combination of the nephron and the capillaries within that nephron. So it's that rounded part of the nephron, the beginning of the nephron, and the capillaries within it. That round part of the nephron is called the glomerular capsule, or Bowman's capsule. And the capillaries within it are called the glomerulus. And together that makes up the corpuscle. So when you see corpuscle, they're talking about the nephron and the blood supply in it. If they're just saying glomerulus, they're just talking about the capillaries, for example. Okay. So a lot of these wastes that get secreted in the urine, a lot of them are due to the breakdown of certain foods that we eat, certain things that we eat. The most abundant is urea. It's the most abundant organic waste. It's formed during the breakdown of amino acids. So if you eat more of a high protein diet, you're going to have more urea in your urine, right? Your kidneys are going to have to work harder to eliminate that, because you're going to have more of these molecules to eliminate. Creatinine is generated in skeletal muscle tissue from the breakdown of creatine phosphate, which is part of making more ATP. So a lot of times when you exercise a lot, you are using a lot of creatine phosphate, and so you're going to end up with a lot more creatinine that you have to get rid of. And uric acid is formed from the breakdown and recycling of RNA, which is what you use to make proteins. Okay. These are the three nephron processes: filtration, reabsorption, secretion. We talked about those already. Normal values for solutes in the urine and the plasma. I'm not going to ask you these values on a test. Okay? You don't have to know these. I'm just, showing you what they are, because you should know what they are. Again, a lot of these should be higher in the plasma, right? You're not getting rid of a lot of them. You're reabsorbing a lot of them. So in step 1, for example, a lot of sodium gets filtered out of your blood. In step 2, you reabsorb a lot of it, so that you end up with a decent amount of sodium in your plasma and not much in your urine. Right now, a lot of that depends on how much sodium you have in your diet, how much excess there is to get rid of. But you want to make sure that you have these amounts in your plasma, and then any excess you get rid of, you pass to the urine. Nitrogenous waste, these are waste products from the breakdown of primarily from the breakdown of proteins, which you're going to get rid of through your urine as well. Then you have something that's called the glomerular filtration rate. That's just how quickly your glomerulus filters your urine, right? How quickly does that urine move through your nephron? And there's a lot of things that it's dependent on, but things like having adequate blood flow to the glomerulus or maintaining adequate net filtration pressures. This first step, squeezing things out of that glomerulus, is due to your blood pressure. If your blood pressure is too low, your kidneys will shut down. And it's because this stops. It's because step one doesn't have any pressure to squeeze anything out of your glomerulus. So there are different events at the different parts of the tubule, at the different parts of the nephron, right? At the proximal convoluted tubule, that's where you're reabsorbing a lot of what got filtered out. So too much got filtered out, you're reabsorbing a lot of those nutrients. At the nephron loop, what you're doing is there's not much net difference in what happens, but as things travel through that nephron loop, it creates a concentration gradient in the medulla of your kidneys. It's called a countercurrent multiplier, and I'm not going to get into that, but it makes your kidney more salty as you get towards the middle. And that becomes important for filtering water later. And then at the distal convoluted tubule is kind of where you make those fine-tuned adjustments, right? That's where you can send some things back from your blood supply to your kidneys or to your ureters. And so you've already reabsorbed most of the nutrients that you need at this point. It's kind of those final adjustments it made. For example, you could increase, if there's aldosterone present, which is a hormone, what you're going to do is increase the amount of sodium that you reabsorb, getting rid of more potassium. If you don't have enough ADH, for example, your body's going to reabsorb more water. You're not going to pass as much water to your I'm sorry, you're not going to reabsorb water. Water is going to stay in the tubule and get passed through the urine. Renin does the opposite of that. Renin's going to make you get rid of water instead of holding on to water. Okay. Then there's there's sympathetic activation in the kidney. So sympathetic activation would be fight or flight, right? It's when you get that rush of adrenaline. It's triggered by a sudden crisis. What happens is the afferent arterioles constrict, which decreases your glomerular filtration rate and slows the production of the filtrate. Basically, when you have fight or flight syndrome, your body is concerned with getting blood to your muscles and oxygen into your body. It's not concerned with producing urine or with digesting food. So this gets blood, shunts blood away from the kidneys or redirects it to other tissues and organs. So your kidneys won't be filtering as much blood. Now, usually it's not a big deal because it's only for a short amount of time. If you're somebody like an endurance athlete, it can be a much bigger deal, right? Because then you're going a longer period of time filtering less of that blood. So things like, certain salts can build up in your body and become toxic. Kidney failure is obviously when they're unable to maintain homeostasis. So oftentimes it's due to something like extremely low blood pressure, right? Will cause kidney failure, but there are certain diseases as well that cause kidney failure. Oftentimes, if somebody is in kidney failure, they're on dialysis until they can get a kidney transplant. And dialysis is just literally pumping the blood out of your body, pumping it through a machine that filters the blood, just like the kidney would, and pumping that clean blood back into your body. So it's doing the part of a kidney just through an actual machine, an actual, machine that models what the kidney does. So then what else do we have? Well, there's not much. There's ureters, which are tubes that lead from each kidney to the to the bladder, they actually have smooth muscle in them. So they squeeze and they move the fluid through a process called peristalsis, just like your digestive system. This is where sometimes you can get kidney stones. What happens is as that fluid sits in the renal pelvis of the kidney, it gets dehydrated. You start to reabsorb more and more water. And if there's a lot of salt, like calcium and magnesium, a lot of crystalline salts, as you keep reabsorbing water, they become more crystalline. They end up getting caught in that ureter, right? So that becomes a very painful condition, which luckily I've never had to go through. But it can obviously reduce or prevent filtration. Most of the time, from what I understand, doctors want you to pass kidney stones. They can give you medication which will make the kidney stones kind of encapsulated in lipids to make them move quicker or move easier through your body. They can actually even use a machine to kind of break them up. And then, the last thing that they would do is to actually do any sort of surgery where they'd have to actually, open up your kidney and do any surgery on your kidney to get rid of the stones. But that's the last thing that they want to do. And then organs for conducting and storing urine. Here's the bladder. The two ureters come into the bladder from behind. That's where the ureters come in, the urethral orifices. And there's the point where urine leaves the bladder. That's where the internal urethral sphincter is. So those 3 points form a triangle called the trigone, right? And that internal urethral sphincter is smooth muscle, so that's involuntary. The external one is voluntary, that's skeletal muscle. They're showing obviously a man's bladder here because there's a prostate. In a man, the urethra is divided into several segments because it passes through the prostate and then through a wall of muscle and then through the penis. So in the man up here, you can see here's the bladder. The part of the urethra that passes through the prostate gland is called the prostatic urethra. This short little part that passes through the tissue there is called the membranous urethra. And then the spongy urethra goes through the penis. Females have a bladder here, and they only have a very short urethra, right? Here's your internal urethral sphincter. Here's the external urethral sphincter. So they don't have different regions of their urethra. And so, as I said, one of the biggest things about the kidneys and why they're so important is that they balance fluids, right? They balance how much water you retain, how much you pass through your urine. They balance your electrolytes. So how many of these ions do you hold on to? Sodium, potassium, chlorine, all these different things, chloride, I should say. And in turn, what that does is it balances your acid base, right? You want to keep the pH of your blood about 7.35 to 7.45. And so you're actually getting rid of extra hydrogen ions when you have them or holding on to them when you need them. And that's going to make your acid base balance better. It's going to either reduce your pH to make it more acidic or increase your pH to make it more basic. All right. So that's what I have for the urinary system. And I would say, as far as I'm concerned, the most important things are, the nephron, knowing the different parts of the nephron, the blood flow into and out of the kidney, right? The flow of the waste product once it leaves the nephron. That's really important to me, and how you get through this chapter, and knowing the 3 steps of urine formation, filtration, reabsorption, secretion. I think those are the most important things for this chapter. What we will do on Fridays, we'll go through the reproductive system. And I did post in Moodle, I posted